Welcome to Agile University. My name is George Talbot, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening to one of our inaugural lectures by one of our new professors, Paresh Wankhade, Professor of Leadership and Management in the Business School. Before we begin, and given the expert nature of the audience, I should point out that we aren't expecting any kind of fire drill this evening, so if the alarm does go off, and Thursday is the day when it goes off, and we do have the drills, but generally not this hour of the evening. We do have two emergency exits, one here and one around the corner there. Paresh joined us about 18 months ago now, having spent 5 years at Liverpool Hope University, and I know there are some of his ex-colleagues here in the audience this evening, having spent a number of years working in the before that. And he joins us as Professor of Leadership and Management with particular expertise in public sector management, something for which we have something of a reputation at Agile University, being associated with the teaching and nursing professions over the years. Things have changed very significantly at Agile over the last few years. I've been here 5.5 years, but over the last 10 years or so, since achieving university status, and then in 2008 achieving higher degree awarding powers, research degree awarding powers. We have seen a growth in the research culture, particularly since the establishment of the graduate school in 2010. One of our weaknesses in the REF in 2014 was the relative paucity of PhD completions, just 17 across the whole university in 6 years. We have put in place, since that, a graduate teaching assistant scheme, full-time PhDs who do 6 hours, up to 6 hours a week teaching, and we're confidently expecting for the next time around to have well over 100 completions as against 17 the last time, as part of an indication of the growth within the university. The business school has changed very substantially in terms of its engagement with research over the last 2 or 3 years, and Paresh's appointment is testimony to that shift. However, he didn't come to listen to me, he came to listen to him, so I'm very happy to hand over to Paresh to deliver his inaugural lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, and good evening, colleagues. And again, I would first like to thank Agile University to give me this opportunity tonight. I also want to thank all the attendees, and I'm delighted to share my perspectives with this very well-informed audience. I hope my talk will encourage further discussion and debate on some of those important issues which I'm going to raise tonight. Sorry, I'm hoping it works. So I will give a synopsis of the state of emergency research and kind of highlight my own contribution and role in shaping a new research agenda in this field. I will then spell out some of the key leadership challenges facing the emergency services in this very difficult and uncertain times when the public service budgets are facing massive cuts, and I think the staff morale is pretty low. I will highlight a few flashpoints using the metaphor of an iceberg, which needs our collective attention by focusing on some of the workforce developmental issues. My apologies. I will then following my analysis, I will argue for then a leadership style which is motivational and supportive towards staff. I will then provide a critical overview of the latest government proposals for emergency service collaboration and then highlight some of the key challenges for true interoperability between the blue light organizations. I will conclude by revisiting the Titanic story to find out whether there were any other ways to save more lives on that fateful night in April 1912. And then I will argue for finding innovation through an open and creative process in bringing a real transformational change as one of the key factors in my research agenda. Let me first begin by acknowledging the fantastic work done by our emergency services across the country, despite numerous challenges. Now, these unsung heroes, and some of them are present in this room tonight, do their job tirelessly 24/7 with due care, compassion, and wearing a smile. Can we give them a round of applause, please? Now, despite the global nature of the emergency service provision, and you might be surprised, a broad, multidisciplinary understanding and approach in management and the management inquiry about emergency services is a relatively recent phenomenon. Especially studying emergency services in a business school is an emerging trend. And again, there are various factors, I believe. Fragmented nature of emergency community perhaps contributes to some of those reasons. There are different organizational and funding models, private versus public split, and so on. Now, academic knowledge is characterized by a strong theory-practice divide and the primacy of profession-based publications with little overlap and limited understanding of the wider context. In my own work, I've been involved in co-production of knowledge and raising the academic and management profile of the emergency services, and I think this has been an important factor in my writings and research. So along with Pete, and I'm very glad to have Pete today, Pete Murphy in the audience somewhere, as one of my co-founders of the journal which we set up with Emerald, and I'm very proud to say that this is one of the few journals which sit in the management portfolio in the Emerald publication list. And one of the few journals which give a platform for work being published and submitted by professionals. And I'm very proud to continue doing that work. I've also been leading the several specialist panels on the emergency services at various international panels, including the Public Accounts, Public Administration Committee Conference, the British Academy, the European Academy, and hopefully at the Critical Management Studies Conference next year, which Agile Business School is going to host. I'm very proud to work closely with professionals towards development of a new professional doctorate program at Agile University, which we are kind of making it ready for a September 2017 start. And in my previous roles and institutions, I have led specialist institutions looking at emergency services provision and collaboration. So the first issue, which I think I want to highlight today, is this core issue about how people expectation and user expectation are very different than what is being offered by the three services. So I want to highlight some of the key evidence and perhaps share my perspective in terms of how there's a kind of disconnect between what the public expects in terms of what emergency services do and how quickly they want them to kind of provide those functions. And what I want to do is put them to a toot-toot test. Okay, so now, this is what we are telling our children in terms of what the ambulance services does. But in reality, what's happening is very different. So there's an average increase of almost 5 to 6% in the 999 emergency ambulance demand. But only 10% of those calls have a real life-threatening emergency. And 3/4 of those calls, which result into an ambulance journey to a hospital that leads to an admission, in only 40% of those cases. Moreover, some of you might know that the response time 8-minute target is also not an absolute target. So legally, ambulance services can only afford to carry on for 75% of those cases. So 1/4 of those calls may be left legally unattended. Importantly, ambulance services nationally are also now facing a shortage of paramedics, because today ambulance services are not the sole employers of the paramedics. And almost 25% of the paramedics today now work in settings outside ambulance services. They work in GP surgeries, they work in out-of-care facilities, and they work even with private providers. Now, managing such level of demand and quality of patient care is clearly unsustainable. And it is no secret that ambulance services across the country have struggled to cope up with the demand and meet their performance targets. Now, I have written extensively about the limitations of the response time targets and its perverse consequences. So with less money today, greater 999 demand, more advancement even in paramedic skills such as see and treat and hear and teach, I don't think we are taking every single patient to the hospital as perhaps we are telling the people. Okay. Let's check the fire offer then, please. Now, the fire context has changed significantly over the last decade or so. So the overall attendance of fire service is down by 40%. Attendance to building fires is down by almost 40%. Minor outdoor fires are down by more than 40%. Road traffic collisions are down by almost 25%. So the key focus for the fire service today is about preventative function and a kind of more protective work. Now, the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee last month, while commending the fire rescue services about sustaining the massive cuts in their budget, also showed concern about the lack of sustainability of the organization if the same levels of funding continue. But expenditure and firefighter numbers have not fallen to the same extent, and then it raises questions about the purpose and the future of the fire service. What is the service for if it's not for putting out fires? Clearly, fire service needs to make a strategic choice either to confine itself to putting out fires, which in number of cases are already coming down, and maybe lose a substantial amount of staff numbers, or use its brand and engage in a more broader consultative and the preventive work which is currently doing in collaboration with other public services. So, yes, fire services perhaps are not putting out fires in the sense that those numbers are coming down drastically. Let's see what's happening with police. Okay, now even the police services are grappling with this core question of what is the purpose of policing? Yes, it is about fighting crimes, and yes, it is about fighting the burglars or catching the burglars, but recorded crimes, as we know, are showing a downward trajectory. Now, the College of Policing last year did some analysis of the estimating demand in the police services, and I think they came up with some interesting findings. First, the crime complexity has changed drastically. So you've got more cases of crimes of sexual nature and cyber crimes which are showing an upward trajectory. Incidents involving people with mental health appear to be rising, and demand on the police is now associated with protective statutory requirements such as the multi-agency public protection panels. Now, the Chancellor announced in the last spending review, and I quote, "The police protect us, and so we will protect the police." But sadly, that didn't happen. And the Home Office then announced that there will be a cut of more than 2.3% this year from the police budgets, which equates to more than £40 million a year. And any additional money was sought to be claimed from the local government budgets, which again we know, as announced by the Community Secretaries Greg Clark, is being reduced by almost 2.8% for this year. Now, there are already indications of emerging pressure on police resilience. So we see a decreased level of police visibility in the community and on the roads, and increasing requests for mutual aid. So yes, so perhaps catching burglars may not be the key priority for policing today. Now, the point I'm trying to argue here is that there has been a fundamental shift in the nature and the volume of the work done by the three services, but not much of that is shared with the public and the users who demand immediate response to a 999 call. And I think that's a key challenge for the future of the emergency services, to make this offer explicitly clear with the public and the users of the service. The second issue I want to highlight tonight is about supporting a very diverse and a professional workforce. Now, this is a core commitment in the NHS 5-year forward view document, and I think this is also an important priority for the police and the fire services as well. Let's look at what the NHS looks today. And I think the cartoon by the King's Fund is very telling, isn't it? I mean, it looks very, very complicated. So across England, as we know, again, local solutions are being piloted, and perhaps they're even showing positive results, to be fair. In the Northwest alone, for example, there are more than 25 health service reconfigurations and redesign projects currently underway. Now, even if you look at the devolution projects, I think they are moving at different speeds. So what is being touted for Manchester, which is kind of Chancellor's favorite project, is a wholesale devolution of health and social care budgets. But what is coming to Liverpool is a very economic kind of collaboration between different local councils. And then to add to that, we're already dealing with a new model for blue light integration, which has been announced by the government recently, and which I will come in my presentation a bit later. So to put it simply, I think it looks a bit messy, if I may say so. So there never has been a greater need to support the workforce in preparing them for these very uncertain and challenging times. Now, what I have done to illustrate my point is to pick up 3 examples concerning workforce development, largely from the ambulance service, because I could find that data, and also from the police. Now, they're all key commitments for these organizations, and I think they are integral for the success of any future plans and reform strategies. So the first point I want to highlight is about creating these cultures of inclusion. Now, the NHS Constitution is committed in making substantial progress in ensuring that the boards and the leadership of the NHS organizations better reflect the diversity of the local communities they serve. Some of you might have read the Snowy White Peaks study by Roger Klein, which looked at the composition of the NHS boards in London and reported that most of the London NHS boards have a very, very small percentage of BME representation on those organizations. Now, I think it's a massive issue for the fire and police services as well. So events in 2011 in London and elsewhere in the country reflect the importance of these issues. Now, the media reported several times comments made by the Home Secretary and the politicians about how police forces are less representative to the communities they serve, and forces in Britain perhaps are sometimes too slow to recruit non-white officers. Even if I look at some international evidence, we all heard what happened in Missouri in US some time back. So in Missouri, we understand 50 of the 53 police officers are white in a city that is 2/3 American African. In Connecticut state capital Hartford, 66% of the police department is white, when only 16% of the residents are from the same community. And these are just 2 examples. But should this matter? Police officers of different racial and ethnic backgrounds should not be acting differently while on the job or having a different kind of relationship with minority communities. They're all trained to do their jobs similarly and to treat all civilians in the same light regardless of race. Now, diversity among staff is important, but I'm not suggesting that that is going to solve all the problems in the emergency services. But such diversity can help to build trust and confidence. And racial diversification is one crucial ingredient in a large program of reforms. So the evidence I have picked up tonight is, so can you go back? More. is the King's Fund study, which was published in December, which looked at the discrimination levels reported by the NHS staff in 2014. So what the study did is looked at the staff survey from 2014 and almost considered 250,000 responses from the staff who undertook that study. And they looked at the data looking at discrimination levels across 9 different dimensions. And you can see some of those categories in terms of discrimination reported by the staff, not only from the public or from the patient, but also from the staff, colleagues, and also on the other grounds of age, gender, and so on. And what we found is something very, very striking, sadly. So the headline finding from the study is that ambulance service report the highest level of discrimination amongst all NHS staff. And again, if you look at those figures, it's pretty high. Ambulance service staff, again, in the same table, you can see report the highest discrimination levels in 8 of the 9 categories. Now, the study finding also looked at the case of women staff who were reporting discrimination. And while the trend in the other NHS organization was different, in the case of ambulance services, again, that trend is the highest one. Female staff in the ambulance service are still reporting the highest discrimination levels. Now, when we look at the same figures in terms of different occupational groups, again, a similar story emerges. So you can see that, again, ambulance services tend to report a very, very high amount of discriminations. Now, just to help, we need to be careful, perhaps, to interpret those figures, because you might argue that a lot of work which is done by the ambulance services is physically demanding, maybe emotionally stressful, and in some ways perhaps is not exactly comparable with a setting like a GP or a nursing or maybe a social welfare. But the point I'm making here is that it is hard to disagree with the King's Fund study finding that current policies, and I'm not being disrespectful to the current work which has been going on in the ambulance service and individual organizations, but the current policies, it does seem to suggest that those problem is not being addressed. And perhaps there's a view that if we treat this as an HR issue, I think our approach becomes reactionary, rather than, and we don't perhaps often take a strategic view about how do we then create what King's Fund called these cultures of inclusion. What is the solution then? Now again, research suggests that it is particularly important to have visible and sustained top management support for positive diversity and inclusion policies and practices. But it is equally important that it is seen to be implemented effectively and consistently and are reinforced by middle management and frontline supervisors. So again, I think that's an important point, and it's a kind of iceberg for the organizations. The next point I want to highlight today in terms of the workforce issue is protecting staff from bullying and harassment. Now, staff in any organization, in any context, private, public, or voluntary organization, they are, I think, key enablers of any future process of reform and culture change. And again, that's a massive commitment. The evidence I want to share today, again, is a recent Care Quality Commission inspection report from London Ambulance Service, which gave its findings in terms of an overall rating. And sadly, London Ambulance Service now is the first ambulance service in the country to be put under special measures. If you look at those, I'm not sure whether that's visible at the back, but all the overall ratings are inadequate. All you see is red and orange. The only thing which is green is the care level of compassion and care being offered by the service. That's the overall finding. But what is the headline findings? Bullying and harassment, widespread in the organization. Several frontline staff complain of being bullied. Again, staff being demoralized. Culture of fear. Again, a lot of staff feel unsupported for any new initiative. And the nature of job is pretty demanding. And again, this seems to be a widespread problem. Yes, the review did talk about the excellent personal care, compassion being offered by the crew to the patient and the users, and that was really positive. But to me, bullying has no place in any management and leadership style. And some of the factors, perhaps, which I've just pointed out, do lead to or do point to sustained pressures to meet the demand. But I think what we need to look at is more underlying causes for such things. I also looked at some recent evidence from the policing context. And again, this is a survey which was done recently by the Scottish Police, which is a single police force in Scotland. And again, what they looked at is staff surveys by almost 11,000 staff, which was more than 50% return rate. Yes, there were positive messages about how staff view their jobs, how they view their interactions in teams with their managers. But I think the survey also pointed out few areas of improvement. And again, I highlighted some of those indicators. So if you just look at some of those areas, information and communication, massive reliance on nonverbal communication. Almost 50% of the staff feel that there is an information overload. In terms of feedback, I think again, 80% of the staff think that they would not get any support if they had any innovative policies or practices which they would like to share and implement in the organization. Again, 40% of the staff think that their current training is not relevant, and not only for their current job, but even for their future job. And almost 80% think that the current training is not relevant for their future development. More than 90% staff think that this organization does not genuinely support the well-being of the staff. And I think that's quite scary. And almost 1/3 of the staff indicated that they would like to leave the organization. And again, I've indicated some of those factors there. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is again the fact that not that individual police forces or organizations have not dealt with these issues, but I think we need to do more than what is being currently done, because again, the evidence is compelling in terms of what's happening on the ground. The third point I want to highlight is about high sickness rates and what individual organizations are doing. Yeah. So the evidence I'm quoting is the figures compiled by the Health and Social Care Innovation Center, and these figures are compiled from 2009, again reporting sickness absence rates in the NHS. And again, you can see that sadly a pattern is emerging for the ambulance services. Ambulance services across the NHS organization are again showing the highest levels of sickness rates consistently for the last 6 years. Now, the Carter Efficiency Review last month reported concerns over this variation within the NHS, because again, as compared to the private sector, this is pretty high. So the private sector figures correspond to roughly around 1.8% on an average. And even in the wider public services, I think the sickness rates are around 3%. So there's a massive variation in those figures. And 1% reduction in those figures can have a saving impact of almost £300 million into the NHS every year. And again, we know the stats. I think they are well rehearsed around how we can save almost £20 billion a year in terms of cost to sickness absences. And again, so many number of cases are now increasing for mental health issues. But again, the point I'm trying to make there is these are very worrying figures for the ambulance services. Now, there's a well-developed literature on the health impacts of some of those sickness factors leading to the problem of mental health, stress, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other illnesses in the emergency context because of the nature of the work and the kind of emotional nature of the work involved. In Japan, for example, they have even coined the word karoshi, which refers to death from overwork. Now, all the three issues are interrelated, and I think they are very important for the emergency services. I'm not suggesting or trying to be disrespectful here that these issues have either been neglected by the individual organizations or perhaps not given a priority by the service leaders. But definitely the current evidence, which I've just pointed out, does point to a serious problem which needs both a management as well as an academic attention. And I'm very interested to explore some of these issues further with the professionals and other colleagues within academic kind of groups. So what we then need is a very holistic approach to resilience and well-being. Now, emergency services, I've already highlighted, are witnessing a period of massive uncertainty. So new models of delivery and care are being tried and tested. I think there's a new process of merger and reconfiguration currently happening. So it is sometimes then forgotten how people at different levels are managing to cope up with all these changes and uncertainty, or they're just managing to survive. Now, so what I'm arguing is a holistic approach, because yes, organizational resilience is something which is increasingly being looked at, but again, we don't do much about what's happening to the workforce. And I don't think it's only a moral issue, because I think it has significant implications for organizational performance, for employee engagement, cost of ill health, and potential litigation claims. So the point I'm making there is, again, we need to do more to support our staff to cope up with this work pressure. So stress has been identified as the health epidemic of the 21st century by the World Health Organization. For the last 5 years consecutively, work-related stress, depression, and anxiety has been the single most reported complaint to the health and safety executive. And in a recent study in the policing sense, Lidl, they estimated that the cost to the police force alone in England is more than £100 million a year. Now, if we have a greater understanding of resilience and the relationship between resilience and stress and well-being can be achieved, I think we'll be in a better position to proactively implement and support interventions to assist employees to cope up more effectively with the stress that is inherent in some of those emergency service settings. So, a framework which is holistic, and this is something which is recently given by Raymond and Smith, and what they're talking there is looking at resilience at 3 different levels. So we're looking at an organic level, which is looking at how staff or how people could be made resilient at the level of individuals, teams, organizations, societies. They also talk about a fitness plan around issues about strength, stamina, suppleness, and how that helps to make people fit and healthy and in terms of well-being. But more importantly, they highlight to have a holistic approach which looks and pays attention or enough attention to some of those spiritual and mental factors. Now, this is an emerging area of literature, especially in the emergency services context, that people need to understand the emotional and the spiritual aspect of well-being. And again, the point I'm trying to make here is we need a holistic approach to deal with some of those things. So it brings me to the next question then, what is the right culture in the organization? Now, concept of organizational culture and changing organizational culture now is perhaps a familiar prescription for organizational reform in this country, and I think it's high on the government agenda. So increasingly, I think more attention now is being paid to the role and contribution of the subcultural groups within that broader debate. So many high-profile inquiries, and we know some of them, like the Francis report into the death of Mid Staffordshire Hospital, the Bristol Royal Infirmary report, and even the College of Policing Leadership Review and the Ken Knight Reform Report of 2013, they all highlight a need for organizations to create and maintain the right culture to deliver high quality care that is responsive to people's needs and preferences. But at the same time, culture as a concept, we understand, can be very tricky. It is difficult to define, understand, agree upon, and it's very dynamic. Do we then think about a single or multiple cultures? So in my own work in the ambulance service specifically, I've tried to classify different cultures of management in the organization. And we looked at different culture perceptions of groups which, as a paramedic, we looked at people who work in the control room setting, and we looked at the managers, and we looked at the senior execs. And they all have a very different perception about things like performance, about culture, about the future direction of travel, about how they want to see them kind of respond to any of those issues individually and also as an organization. Emergency service culture has been traditionally described as a command and control one, accompanied by tendency to blame sometimes, hierarchical, top-down management styles, resistance to change, and being risk-averse. But again, perhaps things are moving on and things are changing for the better. So in my own work, which we did with John, who is in the audience today, we found out that we found out how change was, or culture change was managed in the ambulance service, and we argued in our study in the paper that any top-down attempt to bring about culture change might not necessarily find support at the frontline staff on account of constant pressure of the meeting performance targets against the ever-increasing demand. And we further documented several negative phenomena according to for the cultural change which we witnessed. I'm also interested to find the concept of how culture then perpetuates in organization, if we think that changing culture perhaps is a positive thing. And I think it's then important to understand how that perpetuates. So we did some work recently, and we used the framework given by Obgona and Harris, who define what culture perpetuation means. So those continuation of core values, beliefs, which then become enduring in a way that the new generation of the people then uses some of those things in responding to various organizational contingencies. So in our study, we had two research objectives. So we were interested to know what characteristics of the organizational culture are consciously or unintentionally perpetuated. And we were also interested to know about what factors help them to perpetuate some of those things in the ambulance services. And what we found was quite interesting. So we found both positive and negative impacts of culture. So the positive aspects of culture, ambulance culture in particular, pointed around decisiveness in difficult situations, compassion, care, and this constant can-do attitude, again, which came out as positive. In terms of the negative aspects of culture, we found instances of people and staff taking personal risk, and sometimes which then encourages a tendency to stick together in the face of threat, and at worst, perhaps sometimes it also results to insular attitudes that might also inhibit change. We also looked at certain factors which helped the whole idea of perpetuation taking place in the organization. And the first factor which was seen in our study was about historical legacy. And again, it's the way ambulance services have been integrated within the NHS structures. Now, it's only in 1974, but still 30 years back, ambulance service became part of for the NHS family. But I think there's a widespread difference in terms of how the other NHS partners look at the role and contribution of ambulance service within the urgent and emergency care networks. That was interesting. We found evidence of organizational symbolism. And again, the 8-minute targets, I think, was very striking. So this whole idea of flashing lights, sirens, this whole idea of paramedic being seen as adrenaline junkies, and almost 8 minutes came out as a glue which holds the whole service together. We also found instances of subcultural dynamics, and again, I've done some work around classifying different aspects of subcultures, and we found they had a very different worldview of the organization, especially in terms of how the organization needs to move from a very simplistic transport service to a more professional healthcare organization, where we expect them almost to become and behave like doctors. We also found interesting aspects of employment practices which came out in terms of how the culture perpetuates. So very insular internal recruitment process, almost a peripheral role for the managers, lack of opportunities for training and clinical education came out as very strong factor in our study, and sometimes, or more often, it was often sidelined due to operational exigencies and resource constraints. And again, that was an issue which was highlighted in our study. And we also found examples of extra-organizational influences, especially how ambulance services always struggle to get patients transferred in the hospital A&Es, because A&Es also have a 4-hour trolley weight target. And you will find this is a massive bottleneck in terms of the overall ambulance cycle, that how ambulance services are sometimes seen playing, and this might be a very wrong perception, almost a peripheral role in the urgent and emergency care network. To me personally, I think they play a very pivotal role in terms of their contribution. The next issue which I want to highlight is important, but I think can be controversial in the emergency services is about the professionalization of the workforce. Now, use of a knowledge base and setting standards and having an evidence base for a decision-making process is absolutely must. So you got the 3 professional colleges and professional bodies. I think they have a very important role to play in terms of the professionalization agenda, which is kind of unfolding across the emergency services. But I think you see a very different story here. So the College of Policing is now a professional body which represents the whole of the organization. The College of Paramedics, while it does fantastic work, I think it's more concerned narrowly with the paramedic welfare and training and education. And on the fire and rescue side, you don't see a professional body in that sense. Yes, you've got Fire Service College, but I think they focus more on tactical and operational bits. So I think you can see different organizations working at different paces. So as a consequence, and I'm not saying it in a disrespectful manner, staff organizations like the Chief Fire Officers Association or the Ambulance Association of Ambulance Chief Execs, I think they continue to hold a massive influence over service and staff. And I think that's an important factor. Now the police, I think, and the College of Policing, I think, have done a remarkable job in taking on consultation about a graduate level entry qualification for the staff. I think that's a massive step forward. But again, that's something which is happening individually within organizations or one kind of organization. And in our work, which we've done with police and ambulance service, along with David, who is in the audience today, I think we have argued massively about the need for a new knowledge base, need about new structures and new policies to take to the next level. But at the same time, what we also find is that I think there's a clear need in the market about a high-level qualification which doesn't sit only within each of these organizations, but which is something which is more broad-based and which allows an interplay of the 3 services together. And again, I'm very proud to share today that we are in the process of developing a new professional doctorate, a DBA program in emergency services leadership, which we are proposing to hopefully validate and run from September 2017. And I've been having this conversation not only with the colleges, but also a few colleagues who are in this room tonight. And I think we've got a very positive response. And we're very excited to lead the academic development of a program which currently doesn't exist. So I think this is something which I feel personally very proud of. Again, I'm very proud of the work I've been doing with the ambulance services and the police services in terms of the recent publications. And I was pretty pleased with the review we got recently by the Policing Journal, which thought, apologies if that's not really legible at the back, which thought that this is an important work and it is successful in bringing together different influential academic, professional and practitioner perspectives. So I think we were quite supported by that. Now that brings me to the next question about what is the right leadership style or behavior which is likely to be effective in a vastly complicated and dynamic emergency landscape. Now I have to acknowledge that leadership as a construct and as a concept defies consensus, both in definition as well as measurement. And a recent study published in the Leadership Quarterly identified more than 65 different theoretical domains and methodological approaches. But when I looked at the evidence from the 3 services, I think there was a very positive and similar message. So the healthcare leadership model on the left is made up of 9 dimensions, leadership dimensions they are called, ranging from leading with care and engaging with the team. But what is at absolutely core in that model is what is called the idea of inspiring shared purpose, that leaders create a shared purpose for individual staff across different settings and inspire them to believe in the shared values that will deliver benefits to the patient, families, and the users. When I looked at the leadership review, I think the College of Policing Leadership Review, again, while it doesn't mention about a single leadership style which can be effective in every situation, but that again highlight a collective style of leadership which is found in many successful organizations, and it is that style which places the leader in the role of an enabler, which ultimately then works towards supporting the team. I also looked at the fire service leadership framework, which talks about moving away from a traditional transactional model of leadership towards a more transformational approach as the best way to motivate staff and perform well. So how does that fit with the literature? Now, the academic literature, again, I'm very happy to share, is in quite sync with some of these professional models I've just shared with you. And I think the whole discourse is moving away from a very heroic person-centered or specific heroic-based leadership model towards a more collective approach to leadership, where this notion of pluralized leadership is getting currency. So sometimes we academics are criticized about living in our ivory tower, but at least on this issue, I'm very happy that we are in sync with the professionals. So the future leader, I think, will have this ability to be very agile and will have skills to manage systems and networks rather than organization. I think that's already the push happening, especially in the NHS, that we need leadership styles which will help organizations and system networks rather than simply individual organizations. So in this Richard Sheridan's remarkable book, we learn about a company where everybody is a leader, and the familiar trade-offs and power struggle normally don't exist, where people treat each other like a family and take care of each other. In another interesting book, Reinventing Organizations, we learn of companies where everyone is empowered and people sometimes lead and sometimes follow. So it is the speed, not the size, I think, which will be key for the future of organizational leadership and in terms of strategic leadership approaches in the emergency services. I want to spend some time looking at the latest interoperability proposals announced by the government in January. So what the government wants to do in terms of those proposals is introduce a new statutory duty on the 3 emergency services to collaborate, enable police and crime commissioners to take on the duties and responsibilities of the fire and rescue authorities, and where a PCC takes on the responsibility of those authorities, again further enable them to create a single employer for police and fire services, and in areas where the PCCs can't do that, give them representation in the local fire service authorities. So does that stack up? I think personally to me, it is a missed opportunity for all kinds of reasons. So I think the scope of the consultation was skewed to begin with. So the government, when it announced the consultation process in September, and I know Peter has also written about it, came up with this idea of already proposing a merger of the police and fire. No other options were considered or put on table. I think this was the first real opportunity in this country to bring real changes, but sadly I think that is a missed opportunity. But yes, there are a few positives. So today the fire services and the police services now work under the same home office, but I think already that is proving to be an uneasy union. So the Chief Fire Officers Association has been raising concerns about the financial model that would be put in a place where the PCCs do take over, and the potential implications of allowing a joint chief officer to designate certain police officers to their fire personnel. They've also been raising concerns about making sure that the police and the fire budgets are protected separately. They've also been raising concerns about transitioning policies around funding and provision to meet national and local emergency and resilience architecture. We don't know much about that, what's happening. I was quite intrigued to read the initial response of the National Police Chief Council when the proposals were announced in September. And I quote what they said. They were surprised to see that the suggestion that the Chief Fire Officer would be eligible to apply for a Chief Constable post included in the government proposal is very strange. So you can already see that some of those tensions are already simmering away. I think the model, will it ensure efficiencies? I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether this is the way forward or is this necessarily the right way forward. Because if it was about having economies of scale, perhaps it would have made more sense than to reorganize the police and fire in the lines of the ambulance services. So in 2006, when the 33 ambulance services reorganized into 11, perhaps that was a way forward to then reorganize the police and fire services. Or even perhaps to go a step beyond and further and take a bold step and maybe think of a national police or fire service or an ambulance service, which is the model currently in practice in Scotland. So to me, a patronizing or a top-down bureaucratic approach to emergency services reform is unlikely to work. And more importantly, no thought seems to have been given to the unintended consequences of merger process. And again, there's a huge body of management literature surrounding some of those perverse consequences of two very different organizations with very different organizational histories, professional cultures, and even work patterns. The next point I put there is I think the model which is being proposed is untested and untried. Now, the government has relied on Sir Ken Knight's report of 2013 for fire modernization. Sir Ken is a visiting professor at the Agile Business School, and he'll be here in a few weeks' time to talk a bit more about that. But if you read his report very carefully, I think there are numerous references about greater collaboration already happening across the country between the police and the ambulance services. And he did mention, and he did propose the idea of the PCCs taking over the police and fire kind of function. And again, I quote, being trialed, not least to examine the range of the opportunities that such close integration between the services might bring. So I think what he was highlighting is that we must test these provisions and we must test this model before we kind of let it go. I think there's also bigger danger in terms of leadership threat, because investing so much of our power in the office of the PCC or the mayor to make them run single organization without a known expertise, because already we had an issue of democratic deficit in terms of how those elections took place a few years back. I think there's a danger that this might take us back to the era of a very personality-based kind of heroic models of leadership. Whereas I think what I've argued earlier in the presentation is about looking into pluralistic models of leadership. What about the ambulance services? Now, the ACE has made it very clear that they see their future of ambulance services in the NHS. Now, whether there is a political drive, and we already hear a lot of sound bites on that, about ambulance services being integrated or partially integrated with the blue lights, I think there will always be a need of two core functions currently provided by the ambulance services in any future configuration. First, as a means of supported transfer for patients in the community to services wherever are provided in the health service local economy. And secondly, a responsive, professional, timely outreaching service. So these are the two core functions of the ambulance service today, and I think they're likely to be there in the future as well. But what is likely to change then is the means of delivery and the professional that drive the service. So technology, for example, today is already enabling better remote triage and increasingly skilled practitioners. And I don't use the word paramedics for future configuration because things might change dramatically. We'll use better decision-making mechanisms to deliver more sophisticated care. So the current, again, proposals highlight a massive emphasis on some of the things around technology, around co-location, around back office sharing of resources and all. But I think interoperability is much more than simply sharing back office functions. And sadly to me, there's very little in these proposals around how do we support the key enablers? How do we support the people behind those changes? We talk about things that as if they're going to happen out of the way, but there's nothing in the proposals in terms of supporting those people, the processes, and the real drivers for interoperability. Because need for cultural change underpins many of the recommendations of the reports I alluded earlier. And as I've argued in my recent blog, I think there's a real danger that unless these issues are addressed, the proposals could promote a merely ritualistic compliance, and the past experience of the imposed performance indicators do suggest that it just might be the case. So to conclude, what then should the new research agenda for emergency services should look like? I think this is a changeable moment for the emergency services. Steady rise in the 999 demand and shrinking public budgets are seen by many people and many commentators, including a lot of people in this room, as two of the key challenges for the organization. But that is not likely to go away in the near future. But what it does present is a massive opportunity to try and bring new innovative organizational forms and management structures to bring about real reforms and transformational change. Because if you just tinker on the sides, you're not going to get a real change. And I think, personally, I do believe this is a massive opportunity to bring a real transformational change. I think there's also a need to look for innovation where we don't expect them. So let me come back to my Titanic story. Now we know that on that evening of April 14, 1912, Titanic collided with an iceberg in North Atlantic and sunk 2 hours and almost 40 minutes later. We also know that out of its 2,200 passengers and crew, only 700 people survived. I think 705 survived, and who were plugged by the 16 boats by Carpentier. Now imagine how many more people or how many more lives could have been saved by the crew and the captain if they had thought about the iceberg as not just the cause of the disaster, but also as a life-saving solution. Now the iceberg rose high above the water and stretched some 400 feet in length and was about 200 feet wide. The lifeboats might have ferried people there for finding a flat spot. The Titanic itself was navigable for a while and might have been able to pull close enough to the iceberg for people to scramble upon. Now such a rescue operation, and it's important, was not without a precedent. So around 1852, about 125 passengers out of about 180 passengers who were emigrating from Ireland to Canada saved themselves in the Gulf of St. Lawrence by climbing aboard an ice floe. Now it is impossible to know whether this rescue attempt would have worked, but at least it's an intriguing idea, but surprisingly difficult to envisage. So the reason behind is what Carl Dunker described as an idea of functional fixedness, which limits our ability to see an object only in the way which is generally and traditionally used. So in a nautical context, an iceberg is a hazard which has to be avoided. And it's very hard to see it any other way. But when an iceberg is presented and described generically as a floating surface 200 feet to 400 feet long, I think its potential as a life-saving platform soon starts emerging. So the point I'm making here is I think we need to find innovation where we least expect it. So the police and the fire service merger is a work in progress, and the position of the ambulance services within this blue light architecture is still being debated and decided. What we then need is a strong leadership to navigate the shape during this turbulent weather and to avoid all potential icebergs. And I think the need for a more meaningful partnership between academia, professionals, practitioners, all to influence the policy context has never been greater. I've already highlighted the need for a pluralistic leadership style because I think effecting the necessary organizational and professional changes requires both a high level of order of leadership and the recognition that there is a fundamental relationship between leadership and the design of the system in which the leadership is being practiced. I've already highlighted the need for systems to be agile. Speed is important. I talked about having professionalization as one of the key agenda for future research in this organization, and having workforce which is diverse, again, is an important ingredient for the future research agenda. Now, before I finish, I think it's customary to thank a few people, and again, I would like to do so. So I would like to thank Agile University for giving me this opportunity to present and share my perspectives in my inaugural lecture. I also want to thank the events team who have been working very, very hard to organize tonight's lecture and move it at the last moment. So thank you very much. I wouldn't be here today without the support of my supervisors, examiners, my current and former colleagues, staff and students at Agile and the various institutions I've worked before. Some of the people are in this room today, and I want to genuinely and sincerely thank you all. To my family, my lovely wife Kavita, and my children, my elder son Gaurav, who couldn't make it today from London because of his medical school commitments, and my younger son Divij, who came straight from the school tonight. They have stood by me while I moved countries and changed careers. And this wouldn't have been possible without your support, so thank you. But most importantly, I wanted to thank the wonderful people I keep meeting in the emergency services settings who have inspired me over the last 10 years or so to write on their behalf, and who have provided me with an academic rationale for my career, for my research, for my writing, and I think whose welfare and well-being is an integral part of my writing and research. Yes, there are dark clouds, but I would like to leave with on a more positive note. You can have pessimism for free, but I think we are paid to lead. So thank you very much for listening, and thanks for coming tonight.
Okay, well, Paresh has kindly agreed to take some questions, but before you raise a hand to ask a question, you may have noticed that there's a couple of cameras here, so we are filming the lecture for our website. So if you do have a question, you can raise a hand and wait until you ask it, until one of our helpers brings you the microphone to speak into. Otherwise, we won't catch the question that you're saying. So, any questions?
No difficult questions.
Okay, at the front here, Charles.
Paresh.
Yeah.
Oh,
sorry. Paresh, some very challenging questions. And towards the end there, you started to talk about interoperability. And about 10 years ago, we had a regionalisation agenda and police forces were going to merge and it didn't happen and so on. And I thought it was really interesting. You mentioned about taking a bold step and maybe moving beyond regionalisation, having a national police service in the rest of the UK like we do at Scotland. I guess my question is, how do we get over that tension of all of the cultural issues that organisations in the emergency services have to get there to have that bold leap?
I think that's a difficult question, isn't it, Charles? And I don't think anybody has a magic bullet. But I think what perhaps is an opportunity now to take those kind of bold steps. Because again, let's come to fire service as an example. Now, the idea of a single fire service is not new. The idea of reorganization of the fire service is not new either. But what has not happened is because I think there's a lack of clarity about the strategic choice for the fire services. Because if the incidents of fire are coming down drastically, I think we need a fire service. Yes, they do an excellent job and they've got an excellent brand. But then do we need a fire service just to put out fires if the fire rates are coming down? So I think what is needed is a kind of radical thinking. And that's why I said personally, and I think this is a massive opportunity to take some of those bold steps. Now Scotland has done that, and they were having a single police force, single ambulance service, single fire service for almost 2 years now. And that's a model. I'm not saying we should follow them, but I'm not sure whether that's possible in a big country like ours. But I think the point that I was trying to make here is I think it's an opportunity to at least discuss these things openly. And sadly, what came out with the government proposal was something which was already being presented as the best model. And we can already see within this, in this presentation about the kind of challenges it's already leading to. So coming back to your question, I don't think there's an easy answer, but I think what is perhaps easy is to have a very open mind and look at what could be done. Now, whether you need a single fire service or single police service, I don't know whether that's the right answer. But what we do need is a very open and honest conversation about how we deal with some of those things, because these are massive challenges. And I think it all concerns us. Chris.
Chris Kenny, Chief Fire Officer. You mentioned fire, so I felt obliged to jump in there a bit. I agree with you that the reducing budgets provides not only an opportunity to change, but a requirement to. You know, services are becoming unsustainable, especially the smaller services. So Ken Knight's review gave various options, but the one thing that is quite helpful is the government have backed closer working with the police. That's driven by purely political reasons, but that's the one that's going to happen. I think the cultural issue is probably a major issue. We can make the money balance in the end, but you said the cultural change can't be top down. Well, how does it happen, and how long does it take?
Well, I think, okay, I wish I had an easy answer, Chris. Yeah, but again, I think we need to speak about those things, and I think I fully agree with you that, and you wouldn't find a better evidence than from the chief fire officers who agrees that yes, anything which is kind of top down and which is laid from the top is not going to work. Because what we have not talked about in a very open and kind of congenial atmosphere is about how are we going to deal with people. Because even if we go ahead with these changes, proposed changes of the merger with police and fire, it impacts people. It impacts people's life, it impacts people's careers. And we haven't talked about that. We just think that's a very mechanistic exercise, that you just have a business case and say, okay, now we're going to merge these organizations. And sadly, I think what is needed is a very, again, an honest discussion about some of those things. And I think culture is an important bit. I think that is the missing, perhaps, piece in this whole discussion. That how do we get on board people who understand that, yes, these challenges and some of the challenges around funding are not going to go away, whatever be the scope. I mean, if we had the unlimited amount of money, I think we'll still be talking about some of the challenges which I have kind of highlighted tonight. So I'm not sure whether I've got a real answer at this point of time, but again, the point I would like to argue is, I think again, this is an opportunity to raise some of those questions. And personally, as a commentator and as a researcher, I don't see much voice from the front line in terms of their view, in terms of how they see whole agenda unfolding. Because I see massive challenges from outside as a researcher, but I think, again, perhaps something more needs to be done from within in terms of taking up these issues, in terms of how those changes will impact staff and managers and colleagues across the police and fire services.
Arif Nawaz from Great Manchester Police, Superintendent. I get the sort of driver for blue light reform, sort of the great collaboration, really probably very Home Office driven. But in Great Manchester, where our real focus is and what's driven our transformation agenda is public service reform. Yeah. So we're talking about working, far closer with sort of adult services, children's services, mental health, trying to deal with demand and issues as a collective. And really that's the real focus in GM at the moment around sort of reform. So in terms of your research and thinking, where do you sit in relation to actually should we be driving blue light reform or should we be really going down the PSR agenda?
I think that's a good point, and I think that's a good question. So something like the CRIT initiative, which is being practiced in Greater Manchester, the Community Response Incident Teams, and the Community Paramedics Project, I think James is here in this audience tonight, who's leading that project in the ambulance service. I think that's one good model to kind of go ahead and go forward. But the problem is, how do we replicate that nationally? Because again, if it's a very local initiative and it works locally, I think it works locally because it addresses and it deals with the local issues. And I think some of those might be different in terms of the focus. So if you look at the devolution package, I think the Manchester package is something which the Chancellor is really backing. But that's a very different package which is being negotiated and agreed by the Liverpool City regions. So I completely agree. I think that's one way to look forward, because if you look at the resilience architecture in this country, I think we call it like a soft view. So unlike a hard view, like the FEMA view in America, which is like a federal agency which looks at everything, I think we have a very kind of bottom-up approach of resilience, so the local resilience forums. Now, I'm finding hardly anybody saying anything about what's going to happen to the local resilience architecture because of these reforms, because of this intended merger with the police and fire. And I think that's a massive, massive negative step in some ways. So coming back to your question, I think, yes, that's a fantastic initiative, and I refer that as an example in my other presentations. But the challenge, I think, a policy challenge, I think, and a political challenge is how do we replicate that nationally? Because again, I don't think there's an easy answer, and I don't think colleagues, some of the things I've been saying, have an easy answer. These are complicated problems, and these are historical problems in some ways, isn't it? So again, my apologies if I'm not being given a more forthright and positive response. David here.
Thank you. One small point and then a question. You're not the first person to have positive virtues in icebergs, because in the middle of the Second World War, Winston Churchill, as Prime Minister, actually commissioned a review of the possibility of floating ice floes down from the Arctic and using them as aircraft carriers. But that wasn't my question. That was just it's not a nonsensical idea. It's a good idea. But the real question is this, interoperability. I think we're very taken by your analysis of the needs for this. I want to put you on the spot and ask, in your view, are we in universities doing enough to further that agenda when we seem to concentrate more and more in silos of professional difference, different standards and different knowledge areas of qualification? And perhaps we train out highly clever people who are almost preordained to find other skill sets and other knowledge bases difficult to get on with. Is there something that we in universities should be doing to further that agenda?
Yes, I think we should be doing more than what we currently do. And I think at Agile, perhaps we do better than many other universities, I can say, because again, in an emergency service context, if you see, I think there's a very clear divide, as I said in my presentation, between theory and practice. We've got wonderful people sitting in this room who have got an excellent understanding of that organizational insight, but that knowledge needs to be transported and needs to be kind of taken to the next level of management and work. So increasingly, I find now there's a greater appetite for some of the high-impact 3-star, 4-star journals to publish some of this work. And some of my work is now getting published in those high-impact journals as well. But at the same time, I think it's also important that we work harder than we currently do. And I think we need to make sure that what we are practicing, I think, is relevant to the professionals, because there's no point teaching management models which don't work in reality. And at the same time, I think it would be a sad situation if we don't make use of this excellent insight and knowledge what colleagues in this room have in terms of the organizational work and process. Yeah. Anil.
Thanks, Paresh. I'm interested in finding out about the challenges for the leaders, particularly in the ambulance service, where commercialisation is actually beginning to impact on things like private tenders and the challenges that actually delivers and things.
And that's one big challenge, but I think another big challenge, which I think alluded in my presentation, is about increasing shortage of paramedic staff now. Because today, and again James will have a view on that, I think ambulance services are not the sole employer, and that is not the sole place where paramedics would like to work that skill. Because what has happened, and again I think as a byproduct of the professionalization agenda, is that increasingly paramedics are upskilling their talent. So you've got different titles of consultant paramedics and specialist paramedics, and I think they are recognizing that some of those skills are relevant in wider different settings as well, which are not uniquely needed only in the ambulance service. So the GP surgeries, some of them are working there, some of them are working in out of the care facilities, and I think some of those skills are useful. So I think that's one big challenge, is to perhaps retain and recruit staff who will like to work in the organization. But if you come to a job, and if you get a job after job every night, and if you find that only 10% of the jobs are real calls, you become disillusioned very soon. I've been on the rounds with paramedics several times, and on a Friday night, that's a very familiar story. Colleagues will, I will see people laughing in the room. It's a very familiar story. That's what you get. So I think that kind of creates a set of people who become disillusioned very quickly and just want to move on. Now, it is no surprise, I mentioned the CQC report, and interestingly enough, that London Ambulance Services also faced massive shortage of paramedics, and they had to recruit paramedics as far as from Australia. So I think while dealing with the other challenge, I think the first challenge for ambulance leader perhaps is to recruit and retain staff, and I think make their work conditions perhaps workable in some sense, because I think the target regime is really kind of taken the ambulance service, I think, to very different place to work, and I think it's a massive challenge. Yeah.
One final question, maybe this is the last one.
Oh, sorry.
Paresh, thanks for the in-depth, excellent lecture. I just wanted to ask you one question, which relates to the staff who work in the 3 services. Now, in order to reduce sickness and absences from the workforce, do they employ anybody like clinical psychologists or people like who can teach mindfulness so that you can retain staff as well as reduce the sickness?
Sure. I think they do, but again, interesting you asked that question, because every time we start talking about well-being and health-related factors, I'm told, and I don't want to be quoted on that there's nothing like a work-related stress in the service. They don't accept that. So if you are claiming that you got a work-related stress, that means the organizational response could be, and this is not, I'm not talking from an NVAS context. I was speaking at the Ambulance Leadership Forum last month, and this happened in a conversation over beer. So I understand, I think there's a view that you cannot be technically working from or suffering work-related anxiety because you haven't gone through the various mechanisms which have been put into place. Now the problem is, yes, you might have a mechanism, you might have a psychologist who come and talk to you, but the problem is, where is the time? Where is the time? You come to your shift, you get sick, you go off. In 2 days' time, the idea is that you will come back and have an interview with your occupational health or maybe your managers. That never happens because you don't see your managers if you are on a shift. And then what it then creates is a cycle where you just come on, do your job, fall sick again, and go on and come in and come out. I might have dramatized a bit here, but that's the kind of thing perhaps. Am I right, Joe? I mean, I've got a few people. And again, they will have a better view. But the point I'm making is I think some of these things are happening, but I think we don't pay enough attention. And I think they're not seen as a clear priority. So in the ambulance context, and I've spent last 10 years talking about those things, it is the 8-minute targets. Nothing else matters. Nothing else matters. Unless you meet your target, that's it. So you have a funny situation where you can save a patient's life if you take more than 8 minutes, but that doesn't matter because you have not met the target. But if you reach somewhere in 7 minutes and if you carry a dead patient, sadly it's fine because you met your target. Now that's, I think, nonsensical in many ways, but that's where we are, sadly.
Okay, well, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Kevin Burney. I'm an Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and it's my great privilege and pleasure this evening to be asked to give the vote of thanks at the end of Paresh's lecture. For those of us who work in the university sector, one thing we all know very well is that our elected political leaders, whatever party they come from, when they look to us, what they expect us to do is to make our research relevant, or to use the word we're all familiar with, to have impact. That it's not just academic in nature, but that it has direct benefits to the economy and society. And I guess it's hard to think of any research area that has more impact than research on our emergency services. After all, they're the services which any one of us at any time, and probably when we least expect it, can come to depend on literally as a matter of life and death. And as Paresh mentioned as well, not only that, but our emergency services are really facing increasing pressures in today's society, whether that's as a result of economic and social change or changing political direction, or whether it's a result of economic cutbacks. And of course, because we do live in a global world, it's changes that not just affect our emergency services in this country, but affect emergency services on an international scale, whether it's in the Northwest or whether it's in Ferguson, Missouri. So research on the work of those emergency services and the strategy and management of them really is of increasing importance. Yet, as Paresh, I think, has highlighted in his lecture, it's paradoxically, it's an under-researched area. And it's one of those areas which certainly we here at Edge Hill are seeking to address through our Institute for Public Policy and Professional Practice, I4P, under which this lecture is staged tonight, and which, as an institute, is seeking to bring us as academics out of those silos. So it's bringing together colleagues from different disciplines, whether it be computing, or this, our Faculty of Health and Social Care, or business and management, together to help address those challenges and problems. And that is no more the case than in Paresh's own research, where he's really been a groundbreaking leader in the field of research on strategy and management of our emergency services. And that's reflected in the fact that he is the founding editor of the first international journal on emergency services, and last year alone was the lead editor of 2 essay collections on strategy and management in emergency services, in particular in relation to the ambulance service and the police. So I'm very grateful to Paresh for sharing his thoughts with us and sharing the findings of his research with us tonight. And I'm sure all of you would like to join me in thanking him for the very thought-provoking and challenging ideas that he has put forward this evening.
Thank you very much.